First off, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. Excited to, have a conversation about diversity and equity and inclusion, of course, but really talking about why it's more than a buzzword. Why it's more than just something to throw around or something to, put up on social media, or, send out an email blast. But really, how do you embody that every day within the workplace, when thinking about building initiatives, about connecting to communities? These are some of the lens that we're going to be looking at diversity and equity through. I just have a couple of housekeeping points that I want to make sure to let everyone know. So obviously, please make sure you're on mute, et cetera, if you're not talking. But we have a couple features that we're going to be using today. So obviously, there's going to be the chat feature. So this is if you hear something you like, feel free to shout out the panelists in the chat, or if you like something or anything like that, or have kind of the general conversation. Then we have the Q&A feature, and that's going to be if you have specific questions for panelists that you directly want to ask them, or for myself as a moderator, any sort of content there. And then we'll also have polls that'll be launching. We have a couple polls that'll be launching throughout the webinar, and that'll just be generally wanting to get some feedback from you all as participants, as attendees, around some of the topics that we're talking about today. And then I also want to give a shout out. Nice. I also want to give a shout out to BioBuzz, the team over at BioBuzz, for hosting this event. And I know that there's just been a lot of growth over at BioBuzz, as well as Workforce Genetics. I myself joined the team recently, about 2 months now. So I'm brand spanking new. And so it's been really good to join the team and really get off to the races, as someone would say. And so I just want to shout out those as well. And I think we're going to get started. Honestly, I don't think there's any really reason to wait around. So I want to start it off. And I know all the panelists are like, who's going to be the first one to talk. But I want to start off really as an introduction. I want you all to get a chance to introduce yourselves, but I also want it to be aligned with what we're talking about today. So I'd love, for you to introduce yourself to everyone, and then also to talk about a moment in which diversity, equity, and inclusion was more than a buzzword for you. Maybe there was a positive scenario in which you saw a success from an initiative, or maybe you saw, a moment in the workplace in which someone took a conversation or something that you told them and really showed that in real time. Or it could have been maybe a challenge. Maybe there was a situation in which you yourself was challenged, or you had to challenge someone else, a coworker, et cetera, to really think about maybe their actions, or to think about maybe the way that they said something or did something within the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think I'm going to start with Mellisa, if that's okay.
Absolutely. So hi, everyone. My name is Mellisa Lawrence. I'm a career and leadership coach. I also host the podcast, Navigating Your Career, and I have a master's in organizational psychology. So this topic I'm really excited about, because it's not only an area I really studied, but I also led talent and development programs for the pharma biotech industry for a number of years. So I'm so happy to be here. So when DE&I became, this question is so hard because I feel like there's so many examples, but I'm going to take it right to the personal place, which is, I have a daughter who's Black, and I became her mom in 2009. And I also came out as gay in 2013. So I had these two really pivotal moments in my life. And those are really important to me, not only for what they represent, but because I have always been an ally. I have always started diversity clubs since I was a child. I always saw myself as inclusive. And it wasn't until I had some of these things impact me directly that it really hit home for me. Things that you don't even think about impact other people until you have to experience it yourself. So like having a Black daughter opened up a whole new world for me when it came to, I thought I was getting in what I knew what I was getting into. And then obviously that changes as you experience it. And then coming out and being married to a man and then moving into being married to a woman, it's like there's things I had to consider that I never thought of before, like where I can travel that's safe. And so I think that just reinforced for me the importance of this conversation and of making workplaces really inclusive for everyone and taking it beyond awareness into something that really embraces the differences that we all have and the experiences that we have when we walk this path separately. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thanks for that, Mellisa. Tia, you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you guys for having me. Tia Lyles Williams, founder and CEO of two startup companies, Lucas Pop Bio and Heliplex. 21 years working in the biotech industry, specifically with Big Pharma and actually manufacturing biological drugs. Lucas Pop Bio is a contract drug manufacturer, meaning they manufacture drugs on contract, specifically biologics, similar to what you have in your arm or you may have in your arm for the vaccine. And Heliplex is the first commercial life science co-working space with a workforce development program on the other side of it. But the purpose of it is to bring in life science startups at seed level and have them actually produce their prototype, whether it's a 3D prototype for a medical device, artificial tissue, or actual biologic drug product to test in animals so they can get to the next stage and get their permission from FDA to move into human clinical trials. DEI for me, I have to be honest, I actually hate it, the word. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's a lot of common sense things with DEI, but it's here. So with me, I'm like Mellisa, I actually lived through it. I am an African American. I topped out at Big Pharma as a senior manager and barely eked up to there for things because I was Black, because I was woman, because I'm masculine presenting, gay. I was told at a company that they weren't ready for somebody like me, and I was the only supervisor, only type of manager Black at that particular facility. I was told that I wasn't politically aware of my surroundings when I met with execs because I didn't wear a skirt and heels to those meetings, even though I was appropriately dressed per professional or casual business casual dress code. So that's kind of how what pushed me to start my companies. One, I knew I wasn't gonna get no higher than where I was unless I was willing to stay there another 10, 20 years to even become a director or C-suite. And I also knew that once I got to that, they're probably gonna have me make a cop out and become director of PR communications versus bioengineering, biotechnology, or manufacturing. So that was the main reason. And then two, I wanted to make sure that Black and brown people had more of a better access to life science as an industry, as an employee or as an entrepreneur. And Heliplex is the startup that was specifically targeting Black and brown people, people from the LGBT community like myself, re-entry citizens formerly, released from prison to get trained on some of these entry-level jobs. It includes third-party certifications and courses from like ISP, RAPS, all that good stuff. And so that is my DEI, putting my action into words, not necessarily preaching and talking about a strategy that nobody implements today.
Yep, I completely agree. I mean, we already talked, so you know where I stand. And the hope is that this conversation will be more of shedding light on those moments in which you had to put it into action and not just having this conversation. All right, so Dr. Carter, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon. So I'm Dr. Brandy Carter, the executive director here at the Biotechnical Institute of Maryland. And we do, it's a tuition-free program. We provide training to Baltimore City residents for them to have entry-level lab positions. And so I'll tell you something that happened very recently that kind of made me think about this as I was preparing for this conversation. We have a participant here who is Muslim. And when she comes, she needs a place to pray. We didn't have it. It made me really think, how am I providing an equitable space for not only my staff, but my participants as well. So that's just kind of DI. It is a buzz term. And I think, like Tia said, it's a very common sense thing sometimes, but then sometimes it's not. And so I'm excited to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. All right, Elizabeth, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth. I'm with Maryland TEDCO, the Maryland Technology Development Corporation. I'm recently appointed as the DEI advisor. I'm also an investment advisor for TEDCO. I've been in the Maryland technology ecosystem now for 20 plus years. On multiple sides of the table as an investor and also helping support companies that are spinning out. I would say we've all experienced some type of issues over the years, but as an investor, I often found myself to be the lone woman in a room, particularly at large events where there are multiple investors around. And as somebody who's charged with allocating scarce state resources, we really thought it was important to make sure that there is broader diversity on the investment side of the table, and that we are intentionally recruiting and looking for companies that really represent the broader stakeholders here in the state of Maryland.
Awesome. And Maygen, you want to go?
Yes, last but not least. So excited to be here. My name is Maygen King. I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia. I work at Thermo Fisher. I'm a manager of diversity, sourcing and strategy. DE&I more than a buzzword. I had all this time to think about my answer. I would say, I think for me, from like the talent acquisition recruiting side, just seeing how hard it is to get diverse folks hired, like just seeing the struggle behind the scenes, I'm like, I want to be a part of the solution. Like it should not be this hard. And I think that's when I just like kind of woke up and was like, I want to focus my career on this. So that happened for me just a couple of years ago. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I think we're going to get right into the meat and potatoes of the conversation, because I feel like everyone kind of hit on it. And so I really want to start the conversation off with talking about, what is the role, right, of corporate America in diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Whether that is strictly an ally, whether that's through initiative, whether that's through funding, where do you all see the role of corporations, whether it's a company? I know that term means a lot of different things for a lot of different people, but I'm curious about specifically if I'm someone who's already at a company, right? I've been here for 10 years. Diversity, equity, inclusion is really important to me. I want to, see it happen in real life. I've been doing all I can as an individual, but I want to try and broaden it and, make it infectious for other people. What are some of the things that I can do, or some of the conversations that I can start to have, or some of the things that you all have experienced through your own life experience, right? Some of us, it's very easy, to see, right? I'm dark skinned, so it's like, yeah, I'm sure you're for DE&I, but how do you get it to those who may not present as someone who potentially, that could be important to them? So I'm curious to hear from you all. What is the role of a corporation, of a company, when it comes to, pushing diversity forward, making it so that spaces, like Dr. Carter says, are more inclusive for people that are not just, the typical person that may show up. And anyone can start, or I can call on someone, as my mom would say. She's a teacher, so I can call on y'all, or you can start yourself. Tia?
I would say, I know sometimes when we talk about corporate initiatives and how, you want to start from the bottom up to get everybody rallied up and supported, but I think DEI is one of these situations where you have to start at the top to get the support. So, if you don't start having those conversations with executives, if you don't start, making it a requirement to take certain courses, I got to take with a IBA. I'm based in Philly. So there's a LGBTQ group here in Philadelphia that represents that community. So I'll be taking some trans courses on how to work with the trans community, how to make sure that the environment is inviting for the workplace. All these things. These are the type of things that at the corporate level, you have to mandate for executives to take these classes. And then that way, now you've given them the tools to kind of navigate some of those difficult conversations and different events that may occur with their people that report directly onto them and trickle down further. If you don't do that, then it's going to become a fad. It's going to become just a term to throw around, and then nobody is accountable for the implementation of it, or making sure that the culture is now changing. I can't say change, right? Because it's a long process, but that culture is now starting to change and trend in the right direction. And at minimum, as we see in the press, doing it for a legal standpoint. If you want to make sure you don't get yourself in a pickle, this is probably the most important things you could do as a corporation to kind of alleviate that and prevent some of those things from happening.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's one of the frustrations that a lot of people face, especially when you're just starting off at a company. it's like, how much do you say, right? How much do you not say? How much do you try to start up a conversation around, being in space? Like pretty much my entire, professional career, I've been the only, Black male, out of a group of 50, right? And so, comments may be made at this place or that place. How do you really have that conversation without alienating people? You know what I mean? You want them to be able to, like you said, change over time and transition over time. I think some of that comes with experience, but I'm sure some of that is, you can learn a lot of it on the front end, and I think you all will highlight that. I'm curious about Elizabeth, from the executive perspective, and TEDCO does a lot of work when it comes to investing in local businesses. I'm wondering, like, what do you think the role of maybe not even necessarily TEDCO, but of a company is when it comes to DE&I?
I mean, for TEDCO, inclusion's baked into our mission statement. We understand what our stakeholders care about. We're a triple bottom line. We want to make returns off of our investments, and it's shown that DE&I led companies, more diverse companies, produce better results. We're also really, supposed to be leading the way, particularly with first-time entrepreneurs who might be overlooked by traditional venture folks or other funding sources. And so we should be going above and beyond to look for those companies and support them and invest in them. So it's really baked into our culture, and we think it's critical. And our leadership team has made a really public commitment to this because we think it is important to all of our stakeholders, both the taxpayers and the legislators in Maryland, and the venture and startup community as a whole.
Feel free to go ahead. Yeah,
Like,
I'm gonna stop calling on y'all now. So yeah, feel free to just pop in there.
So I just wanted to add to that I think at a foundational level, it's really providing a safe space for employees to be their authentic selves at work. So there's the tangible piece of transparent hiring practices, having standards around who gets promoted, pay increases, your hiring practices, your pay scales. There's those types of things. But then I think it's also not just your programs, but the behavior that you have in the organization. Because if you have all these programs, and you have required trainings, and you require leadership to take them, but then there's no accountability, then you kind of break the thread of the culture that you want to have. And so an analogy I like to use for this is how you learn manners and how you learn to treat people when you're growing up at a dinner table. So if you're all sitting at the dinner together, and whoever your caretakers are, and you learn what's right and wrong, can you chew with your mouth open? Can you speak if not spoken to? What time do you all have to eat at the table? Can you eat wherever you want, right? You learn all of these norms, but you don't learn them through a training, right? So like your caretakers don't take you together every quarter and say, okay, now these are our rules. You learn based on the behavior that people have, and by seeing what happens when people break those norms. So if you have someone at the dinner table that's on their phone and they're not supposed to be, but nobody says anything to that kid, but they do to this other kid, then you start to see exceptions. And I think that's where things can come apart in an organization, is you have all of the good intent, you have the mission, you have the programs, but then what happens behind closed doors? Like what happens when you have a no tolerance policy and then somebody breaks that policy, but you make an exception because of who they are, how long they've been with the company, and so on, because then other people see that and they don't know what's happening behind closed doors. They just see this thing happen and this person's still here. Or we're saying that we have this inclusive culture, but we're not promoting people at a fair level, or we're not making our pay scales visible. So we don't really know what the gap in pay is. And instead of fixing that and putting that financial investment at the company level to make it fair, we keep it hidden and then try to incrementally improve it, which just takes it longer to have that inclusive workforce that you want to have. So I think it all just boils down really to providing that safe space, which you do through programming, but more importantly, you do through the behavior and the accountabilities that you have for that behavior.
I just wanted to echo, Mellisa, the making this a daily habit. It's something that's discussed at every board meeting. You're tracking data, you're reporting your results, and across the organization, both the internal stakeholders understand what how the company is doing, as well as the external stakeholders.
Go ahead, Megan. I'll let Megan talk. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, the things that stood out to me was at the top, right? Leadership and then accountability. So one way I've seen several big corporations do is they tie it to their money, right? Their bonus, right? That's where the accountability is. And I know McDonald's is one that's doing it. There's a lot of companies that's doing it, because it's nice to say, oh, it would be nice if we did this, or it would be great, or I like it. But when you start messing with people's finances, right, and their bonus, and you're really keeping them accountable, that just changes the game completely. And I definitely think that makes a bigger statement coming from top down to see how serious they are about it. So
I was going to say, I'm sorry, Tia.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Exactly, what does accountability look like for most of us, right? Or most companies, right? That's one question. And I think diversity, I think there are a lot of workspaces that have diversity, but if everyone's diverse voice isn't being heard, that's different. Because diversity looks like a lot of different things, right? Gender, race, socioeconomic status. But if these voices aren't being heard, then they're just a presence that's there. So what does accountability look like for these corporations? I think, Megan, you hit it, money, right? If it's tied to their money, that's a hard impact, but I think it has to stop from the top down when it comes to bigger corporations.
I was going to say the same thing, accountability being tied to that money, but also there do need to be some systematic things in place to remove all of that, the vagueness, you know what I mean, out of the way. And that's how some of the times us as African American, Black and Brown get into a pickle, because we see it on paper, we qualify, but there's all this other ancillary things that are not on paper that they want to count as having a higher value to get you in that higher level of employment and higher pay. So it definitely still, even with those things, has to be something systematic to rule that out, so that this thing on paper actually trumps all those instances where somebody may say, oh, I saw Tia this day and it was a bad day and she said this, or da 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 da. People don't always know what's going on with different situations, and it could be completely professionally related where something happened at work, but that part has to be pushed out all the way in order for us to be to make the DE&I stuff work. And you have to be intentional. So not just setting rules and having accountability and messing with finances. It needs to be actual numbers. You need to have XYZ percentage in your department. You need to have XYZ percentage in your C-suite, or making mandated that if you have 2 supervisors, it needs to be a diverse team on purpose all the way around. We can't just leave it up to individual directors or managers to make these decisions, because they're not going to make them. Most people are going to do with what they're comfortable with. And that's a problem.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm curious to know from you all is, so how do you influence, right, the top of the food chain, so to speak, right? If you're really passionate about DE&I, but you're, maybe your manager level, maybe you're, lower, and you don't necessarily have the quote unquote power, right, to just do it yourself, right? How do you get that buy-in? I know for me personally, one of the things that I always try to do whenever I'm just in a work environment or in just a space in general is build relationships, right? Like for me, it's always important to try and get to know someone and try and get them to know me, and then, be able to bake the importance of being inclusive into general conversations so that it's easier when I'm trying to, start an initiative or do something like that. So I'm wondering, are there moments or things that you all thought about in which you were able to kind of figure out how to shift it and maybe say, hey, I want to make you accountable as a leader or as the supervisor, or like, how do you do it? Like, how do you soften the blow or not soften the blow?
One example, so I had to do this at the top of my career when I worked in human genome sciences. This is right when Barack won. Everybody starting the DEI talk and how to get this done, and we was doing Celebrate Black History Month. And so instead of honoring historical African-American figures in science and engineering, we honored our African-American staff on site that were in manager roles. I had to get HR to buy into it because I was just a lower level farm associate working on the manufacturing floor. So the way I did it was work with my team leader, my supervisor, hooked up with HR. HR was responsible for coordinating other departments to highlight different African Americans. And that's how we I don't know if they kept it up since I left, that was years ago, but that's how I kind of at least got the conversation started and got some buy-in into it by having those individuals being represented on site so people can know who they are. And then now those conversations will start to trickle down with, or trickle up, I should say, with their respective directors. But HR was kind of like the mediator. If anybody can talk to an executive when it comes to this stuff, nobody looks at HR crazy. They might look at me crazy because I'm Black and I bring it up. They might look at the white associate crazy because they Black and bringing it up, and they like, oh, I don't know how to navigate this, right? I don't want to get into a situation. But if it comes from HR, you have HR's buy-in and kind of help mediate and coordinate those conversations as you're doing your strategy and planning. Now everybody's on the same playing field. Now about everybody's anxiety is down because HR is involved and kind of helping us navigate how to get through that process.
Maygen, did you have something? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. I love that. And another avenue would be employee resource groups, ERGs. So that's something that's big at a lot of companies. I think for me, like getting involved in our African Heritage Employee Resource Group, I mean, it's major. I mean, we've got VPs, there's a lot of high up leadership that supports it. So whenever we have an issue, I think there's a couple like, hey, why aren't we off on MLK Day? You know, just certain different things like that. We just bring it to our employee resource group and they just handle it for us. So just sometimes when you don't have that connection, just being a part of that group and being able to speak your voice on behalf of that, I've found has been very beneficial.
So I just wanted to add what Tia said about the awareness piece. So when I worked with AstraZeneca, I'm not responsible for it, but there was a great campaign that I was a part of called This Is AZ, and it was a hashtag that employees were procured and volunteered to share their story. And then there were these little videos that they did, and they posted them on Twitter and all the social media with the hashtag This Is AZ, and it highlighted stories of all different employees. And that was really impactful. And we actually saw a lot of change from that. So for example, we had just in our HR systems, non-binary was added as a drop-down menu option because of that story. A story I shared was around not assuming who someone's married to. So, you know, based on my appearance, a lot of people assume, and I have children, they assume I'm married to a man. So I often get like, what does your husband do? So you know, being able to have that conversation and me saying that opened up people's eyes to those little things that people can do to be more inclusive. We started putting pronouns in emails, like all of these different things came off of just having people share their stories, and the people that are open to that will do that, and that will really help. But I think also going back to what I said earlier about the behavior that you have at work and not just making it a poster, but making it part of the expectations and those accountabilities. Something that I did with some success was we really worked on our one-on-ones and the expectations for managers and the conversations they were having in their one-on-ones. And so a lot of times when you have one-on-one conversations, it can just be project focused, like where are you at with this deadline or deliverable? And instead we created a framework. This was part of that work that I did in grad school around what are the things that we can measure, that we can do as a path for having meaningful conversations in one-on-one that is standardized, but then also gets to some of those deeper conversations around the experiences that employees are having. And just doing that, we saw like in our employee engagement survey, we saw like double-digit increases around inclusion and around employees' views of their managers just by focusing on that. So that was tied to DE&I, but we didn't brand it as this is a DE&I initiative. It was more, how can we make these conversations more meaningful and make the relationship between the manager and the employee a safer one to be honest and have trust.
So I'm just going to add a different perspective because like BTI is a really small nonprofit, right? I have 7 staff, including myself. And so, you know, one way is to create like a safe space, right? To have conversations and really tough conversations regarding different perspectives and making sure you feel included. But one way I look at it is from my participants. You know, my students come from all various backgrounds. My cohort right now is 90% West African, so cultural things, right? That we have discussions about. So for me, it's really about creating a safe space for staff, students, you know, what is their perspective, and then making sure everything is equitable for everybody that walks through my doors. So I just wanted to kind of give you, because we have a really just a small, tight staff here, and the majority of my staff is African American. And so I also have to make sure on the flip side of that, my staff who isn't don't feel a certain way too, right? Because they're included in this broad definition of DEI. So I always don't want to limit it to just race and gender. I think me and Ezekiel talked about this, is those who have different abilities or disabilities too that are wrapped up in this whole buzz term too. So just another kind of way I want to put that out there to think about it as well.
All right, I wanted to make sure no one else had anything else to add. So I think obviously we talked a lot about top down, about getting buy-in. Mellisa talked about creating a framework for those 360 conversations, which is something that I did a fellowship a couple years ago, and one of my advisors suggested that, and that literally shifted the entire my work experience, because I was having a rough time where I was at, and that really creating a framework that made it feel more of a give and take. It just changed the way that I communicated with my supervisor at the time. So that was great for me. So I want to take maybe a look at the flip side of it, right? So we talked about top down, et cetera, but I want to talk about workforce development, training, recruiting. How do you bake it into that end of it? I know, Maygen, we talked about the work that you're doing. Dr. Carter, we talked about the work that you're doing. Tia as well. What are some of the things that maybe you think about when you're trying to maybe build out a plan to recruit, or building out a plan to engage with participants in your program, Dr. Carter? What are some of those things that you think about and maybe put into place as you move throughout the work that you're doing?
So I'll look at it from the perspective of when I'm trying to place my students with employers, right? And so I like to align myself with companies that have diverse hiring practices. They demonstrate equitable hiring values of the workplace. And also, a lot of my participants are African-American women. So I'm still placing them in companies that are primarily white, male-dominated spaces, right? So when I'm talking to hiring managers and recruiters, I'm like, what is the culture of your workplace, right? What are your, if someone has concerns, and how you combat discrimination. So those are things I'm concerned about when it comes to DEI from perspective of my students. When I'm recruiting, we have a non-discrimination policy. So we're open to everyone and anyone, but I'm more concerned when I get you in these doors and I train you and I go to place you in employment, I'm placing you in a space that's safe, that your voice is heard and understood, and that you're appreciated and valued. So that's kind of the lens I come from when I look at my participants who we serve.
Go ahead, Maygen.
Okay. I was just going to say, regarding recruiting, what do we have to think about when putting together a program? One thing that we learned quickly. So one of the projects that Thermo Fisher is doing is called the Just Project. And it's hiring 500 HBCU candidates in 3 years. And it's, something that I'm super passionate about because I graduated from an HBCU. So I was like, oh, definitely want to be a part of this. But we quickly learned as we started that most just naturally people thought, oh, this is on talent acquisition. Like the recruiters will, fix this for us and they'll do it. But what we realized is that it's on everybody. It's on the hiring manager. It's on HR. It's literally everybody, all hands on deck in order for us to be successful. And I think once we figured out that formula, we were able to go far. But it's like, I can find an amazing candidate, but if the hiring manager, isn't on board, then I'm stuck, right? And then if this amazing candidate needs relocation, or maybe we need to pay them more money, I need HR on board. And so it definitely was like an eye opener to, so often we're like, well, this is this person's responsibility and this is this person's responsibility, but really it's everybody's responsibility so that we can be successful and get the job done.
I was going to say, I come from perspective a little bit differently. I know me and Brandy are in the same industry as far as working for individuals to work in biotech. And I'm sure she's aware that, people talk a good game about what the culture is and all that, but we can't control that. Once you put that candidate in place at that job, that's it. It's sink or swim until, you give me some feedback where I can come to the employer and say, hey, we need to talk this through or whatever. There's always finances involved, and so you got to navigate that carefully, right, for the benefit of the student getting to that program and having that somewhat guaranteed job at the end. So for our program, we'll be arming our candidates or our students that go through the program with resources on how to protect themselves, putting them doing role playing and say, if this happens on the manufacturing floor, this is how, you know, you should think about this, how you should react. You need to document, this is the appropriate chain of command. You need to follow that chain of command. These are things that are not really talked about, even in college. I don't care if it's at a PWI, HBCU, Ivy League school. These things are not talked about. You don't know this stuff until you get into that situation. So that's what we're including in our curriculum, these wraparound teachings or learnings to help them navigate as an individual and as a person, and understanding that you shouldn't have to go in to assimilate. You can still be you. You're going to always be you. We're going to always be different, whatever it is. But this is how you arm yourself to protect yourself and get yourself prepared for when certain situations happen. And it still may not go in your favor. So if it don't go in your favor, arming them, okay, these are the next steps you need to take. Do you need to just keep your head down and work, or do you actually need to take a pivot and get out? Do you have the tools necessary to go a little bit further and file that lawsuit? And everything is not a lawsuit, right? You got benefits and negatives to each, whatever situation, what path you take. So that's the way we're going about it, because I know that I really can't change the culture or force these employees one way or another. And I need them, right? Because they have to employ these candidates when they get out of the program. So that's how we're doing it from the opposite end, and making sure that they have that support on them and they know who to contact on our end if they need help with that.
Yeah, I do like that idea, Tia, and thank you for sharing that, because again, we get a large population of folks who are not U.S. citizens, and the idea of them walking into a workspace and feeling excluded based on culture really does scare me. So thank you for that idea of arming them with the knowledge beforehand of what to do if they encounter a situation like that.
I just wanted to add a piece. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Tia.
I was telling Brandy, we'll talk after this. I was like, right on.
I just wanted to add a piece around the training. I think the awareness training, for me, training events are really awareness, especially from really most topics, but especially for this one. So I think it's important that you have an application piece associated with it. So there's a couple of things I've seen done successfully. One is we at a prior company had this kind of diversity bingo, which sounds a little bit cheesy, but essentially it forced you to have conversations about things that you wouldn't normally talk about at work. And so people volunteered to be a part of this, and you essentially had to fill out your bingo card that had different attributes about someone, and it would help you have a conversation about them with information you might not know otherwise. So that was a really cool kind of fun networking event that people were able to do, that kind of highlighted and brought people together. And it really, I had a really meaningful conversation after that event, which when we talk about DE&I being a buzzword and being inclusive to everyone, where I had a white male senior leader approach me after that event, who was a great ally, attended a lot of these activities. And on the bingo card, we didn't have like a white man or something that would represent a white man on the bingo card. And he came over and it was, he had just such a vulnerable conversation with me, where I felt really honored that he felt so safe to share this with me. But he essentially shared that he was having a hard time navigating, leading the inclusion efforts when he couldn't really identify with some of the experiences that usually represent the DE&I efforts. And so for him, he was like, I feel really awkward because he doesn't want to be the enemy. He doesn't want to be seen as the bad guy. He recognizes he has privilege, but so he doesn't know how to have the conversation. And I think that really spearheaded into this whole other kind of conversation around leading these programs and feeling so passionately about it, but making sure we're not leaving people behind that are important for the conversation and that are important to help everyone rise up. So I think having those types of application, in addition to your kind of awareness or webinars or things that you can do, help bring out some of those conversations. And then the other thing that I'll add is I've seen like other programmings that include an element of coaching. And I think that's really helpful too. Like I'm obviously a coach, but I have people that come to me with similar things where they're like, I want to be an inclusive leader, but I don't know how. And I don't want to talk to HR about it. And I don't want to talk to my boss about it. I don't want to let them know how I really think and feel. And so I think providing a safe space, whether it's a program, a leadership development program, where maybe you have coaches assigned to cohorts that can meet with the people that are going through the program one-on-one to work through some of those things. You have to be able to create that safe space to be vulnerable. But I think it's really about getting into application and helping people uncover their blind spots. But to do that, especially in the workplace, you need to have that level of psychological safety to be able to really ask people to be vulnerable, because I don't think it's the employee's responsibility to create the mission or the vision or the DE&I culture. They're part of it, but I think that they're not, you can't rely on the employees coming in to be the ones that are going to lead it. We really need it, again, back to what we said in the beginning, from the top down. And I think we need to get everyone involved.
Right. And I think that goes back to someone mentioned earlier about making it the third parties, right? You need those consulting agencies, you need those outside eyes. You definitely need to do an internal assessment via a third party to see how your company is really doing. Not from what, oh, I don't really see any of that and I haven't seen anything. No, get the real numbers and the experiments from the company as a whole. Get that data on paper, have them take those surveys, make it mandatory for executives to do so you can actually compare the different thought process between management and the people that report to them, and then collectively, where are we as a company? What does this look like outside of just, oh, we have one or two Black people here or Spanish people here? It's deeper than that. It's always deeper than just putting a Black and brown face in that seat. It's so much more attached to that. And I think that's what people need to recognize with DEI. It's not just about the money. It's not just about the opportunity sitting there. It's also about the output and how your company is represented in the industry. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback off what Tia said, I was at a previous organization and the entire executive team was Black. And so we hired somebody to come in, kind of have some conversations regarding diversity. And the non-Black employees really felt like we had this alliance and that we were, I always want to use the term reverse racism, right? And it was shocking to me. And I'm thinking, this can't be a real thing. But in their mind, it was a real thing. But we had concrete data to support what they felt. And it really gave us an opportunity to change the culture of the organization, right? So hearing what they actually felt, having a non-biased third party come in, do the work for us was really beneficial.
Yeah, I think that is an assumption that people often make, that that there's one way to look at it. And I think when you have those different experiences, which I think a lot of things can only be learned by going through it, your worldview gets wider and wider and wider. And so like, for me, meeting, whenever I met the first person that didn't have English as their first language, that widened my gaze a little bit more. Someone who, wasn't born here, or, someone who's a returning citizen. There's different ways to look at it. And I think, we're hitting on the topic of, a lot of things I'm hearing is conversation, buy-in, accountability. These are, the terms that are really the tools, so to speak, that make you be able to sustain it. Because that's one thing I've seen. I went to a predominantly white, high school, and one of the things that I saw was like there'd be a day, right, of a thing, and then the next day you don't even remember that day happened, or no one really talks about it. There was no follow-up, there wasn't consistent check-ins to check the temperature of people and how they're feeling about this topic that everyone was hyped about today. And that's one of the things that I love from this group already, because you saw Tia and Dr. Carter are already going to have follow-up conversations about ways to collaborate, because that's ultimately what the goal of this is not just to have the conversation, but to find ways to really bring communities together, bring organizations together, to, make a bigger push overall, because at the end of the day, it's going to take more than just one person or one company to create this change that we're starting to see, bits and pieces, here and there. But anyway, I wanted to shift gears a little bit. If anyone didn't have anything to say, on that topic in terms of workforce development, training, those kinds of things. I want to talk a little bit about money. And that was something that we kind of hit on at the beginning. But I think that's something people don't think about. I know that, we talked about wage differences, right? Being a hot topic, for people who are in that position where, you may get the quote unquote role, but your money, your paycheck doesn't reflect that, and you may not be aware of that, especially if you don't have an awesome team member that says, "Hey, this is how much I make," and then you go, well, "This is how much I make, and I've been here longer than you," and you go, "Okay, well, and then what do you do after that?" So that's kind of one way to think about money. And then there's another way, which is kind of along the lines of, more so Elizabeth, Tia, and Dr. Carter, which is the second part of, for those of us who maybe have entrepreneurial ideas or potential like dreams or things they want to put into place. How do you, from an investor, invest money equitably? And then how do you, as someone who's trying to get investment, pinpoint people who are investing their monies equitably? So I like to maybe break that up into two parts. So one, from the perspective of an individual, realizing, maybe that there are some differences in the workplace, or as a manager, maybe not being aware of that. And how do you navigate that? How have you navigate that? How have you coached someone? What does that look like for you? And then we can talk about from an investment entrepreneurial perspective on the back end. So whoever wants to start, you can just unmute yourself and we can get it going again.
I was going to say, from an employee standpoint, some of the ways I navigated that to make sure I was getting the appropriate salary for the role that I was going after. I mean, now you have like Glassdoor and all these other sites, and I look at that, right? What's going on in the market per the country, per the state, per the city, per the county that I'm in. So again, arming myself with these resource information, when I sit down with these interviewers, I know what to say. I may role play with somebody else. I may role play with myself in that situation prior to that to prepare for that. The other thing that you want to do is to make sure that your skills are well represented on your resume. There's nothing wrong with having a resume in front of you, reading it if you need to speak to every point to make sure that you're providing some type of validation of who you are and what your work ethic is and what you've been able to do and accomplish in your career. I never went into an interview without my resume in front of me, because you do, especially when you get up into the management and executive level, you do so many things, you can't remember everything. So what I did was I always had like a notebook somewhere I would document everything, and then a certain period of time I'll look at that, redo my resume, redo whatever, and I always had that ready to go, including the LinkedIn profile. That's super important too. People think that, social media is not important, or not marketing yourself as an employee is important. It is very important. If it wasn't important, it's definitely important now, right? You want to make sure that you're being authentically represented, not just on paper, but also on your social media accounts, especially LinkedIn. But that's one of the ways I was able, and I never took the salary that they offered as even if it was good, I don't care. I always come back something a little bit just ridiculous enough, right? You don't want to be too ridiculous, but you want to be ridiculous just enough so that when they do come down, they meet you where you want to go anyway. That's how you negotiate that situation as an employee.
I'm a big proponent of know your worth, right? So I know when I walk through the door and I've applied for this position, I know what I'm bringing to the table, but I'm also making sure what I bring to the table matches what they need too. I'm doing my research. I'm looking at, like Tia said, what are the salary ranges in different parts of the country based on where I live and all these things. But I'm a big proponent of know your worth. Don't sell yourself short when you walk through those doors. Know what you bring to the table. You're selling yourself ultimately, right? But you make sure you're selling yourself authentically, and make sure your actual job qualifications match with the job position list. And so, like Tia said, LinkedIn, huge networking opportunity. Everybody goes on LinkedIn. Everybody looks at LinkedIn. So make sure your skills, your qualifications, your endorsements, all those things are updated. Because employers will scan your resume and go straight to LinkedIn. to make sure your resume matches what's on LinkedIn now. So just show up, authentically as who you are. Just know your worth.
Yeah, and one more thing, because biotech specifically, even though it's big, it is rather small. People that work in it, we didn't work for the next company, went across the street, went up the street. We didn't all work together. So watch what you say in interviews. If you don't really know a person, don't drop no name as an advocate. Don't do none of that, because when I was in a position of hiring people, I called. Somebody did that. Oh, I worked for Tim, and oh, you did? Okay. After that, hey Tim, you work with so and so. How was they really doing? And I got the real scoop. Like, you have to represent yourself well, and if there's some things that you don't want to come out about what you did for whatever reason was going on with that employer, I advise you not to find a way to bring that up. Don't drop no names. Don't do nothing. Just stick to what's out there that you want to discuss. Just had to put that out there. We do call. We do go back and check and look to see whether or not what you're saying is actually true, especially if you name drop.
I was just gonna say, there was a post that went viral on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, where it was like a girl saying that the candidate only asked for X, Y, and Z, but the employer was willing to pay. Y'all know what I'm talking about. And I thought that was interesting, because from like a recruiting standpoint, I feel like, oftentimes we talk to candidates and they're not really sure. I'm like, okay, what are your salary expectations? And they're just like, it's like this game, like, you go first. No, you go first. But to your point, Brandy, I do think it's important to know your worth. And I feel like that confidence goes a long way, because when you come in already knowing, like, I know what the market is for this position, I know what I'm worth, I know what I'm able to bring to the table. And I agree with Tia, definitely don't accept the first offer. And people ask, they're like, can I counter? Absolutely. Absolutely. That is always a yes. And I just think it's people, they don't understand. I just think they need maybe some more education. Because I remember years ago, the company was like, yeah, we're willing to pay her this if she asks for it. So I remember feeling very awkward as a recruiter, and it can be tough, but I think that's why it's so important to do that research, whether it's Glassdoor, wherever, and just know what you're worth, but not what you're worth, but what the job is going to entail and what you should be paid for that. So I think that hopefully that answered the question, but I see that a lot.
And feel free to say that you need time to think about it. I don't know. I need time to think about it. Let me get back to you to give you that number. And now that gives you even more time to go look on Glassdoor or whatever to see what's really going on before you, put yourself in a situation.
Real quick, I think one thing.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead. Go ahead, Mellisa.
I was just going to chime in and say, I agree with all of that. I think a way to make it objective is to look at what Maygen was saying a little bit about looking at what the role requires. So I think it's hard sometimes for people to assign a worth to themselves. They always devalue themselves. So I think looking at it as, what is the role that you're interviewing for, and what is that role worth? What should you be paid based on your qualifications and for doing that job? Because I think sometimes we go into it thinking, I'm going to discount myself. Like, they want, the star in the moon in this job, and I only have the star. So I'm going to undervalue myself. And I think you need to look at what it is that they're really looking for and what that job is worth. Get that value, not what will you pay me based on what I've been paid before, because that's only going to keep the gap larger. And I think also, depending on your network, again, speaking of how important your network is, you can always ask the question in an objective way to people in your network. Like, hey, I'm looking at this position and it's saying it's this and this. What do you think would be a fair salary for that? And that can be really helpful based on who you know to get an objective range if you can't get it in the recruiting process, and to take yourself out of it, because you're not asking, what should I be paid? Or I'm interviewing for this, can you check it out for me? It's just more of an objective question when you can't find that information from other sources, to be able to get a value that is going to be more fair. And then always negotiate. Know that everything is negotiable. People can negotiate more vacation days, pay, bonuses, all sorts of things. So always look at what you want, not what you think that you can get, and shoot for that.
I think, I completely agree in that you actually, took some of the words out of my mouth for sure. I think it's important to, one of the things that I realized very early in my career is that a lot of the times, when you're in these new spaces, you don't necessarily have anyone in your network that you can turn to, right, to kind of ask those questions. Like for me, at many points in my life, I was the first one to do this in my family, the first one to do that. And I feel like a lot of people who come from more diverse backgrounds, maybe more working class or what have you, it's so important for you to try to find a mentor in that space to bounce ideas off of, right? To ask those awkward questions that you don't feel comfortable. Because I remember one of my first jobs, like I didn't take any vacation days. Like I didn't think that, I just worked, I wasn't thinking of anything like that. I didn't quote unquote know my worth. And thankfully I had a great manager that was like, hey, why haven't you done this? Or why are you trying to, push all your sick time to the weekend? Or, why aren't you taking advantage? He was like, I want you to take full advantage of this because that's the role. The role includes all these things. And I feel like particularly for, from my experience as a person of color in Baltimore City, you don't take those leaps of faith. You think that you aren't worth this because you might have been used to seeing your parent or your guardian or whoever just work day in and day out and not ask for anything else. And I think that that's one of the leaps that I'm seeing more and more when it comes to talking to people who are younger in their career, of trying to build up that confidence that you can have a conversation with someone like a hiring manager or someone who's a recruiter, and really talk to those other pieces that are going to be important for you to be able to maintain your sanity, definitely at certain roles, to have that kind of full circle moment.
Yeah, so I agree with mentorship, right? And so I know without proper mentorship, I would not have been prepared for the role I'm in now. And my last job, the woman who was the executive director, I don't even think she knew she was mentoring me. And it wasn't a formal agreement, but I watched her leadership style, and I watched everything about her. And unknowingly, she really gave me a great example of what leadership looks like, what advocating for your staff looks like. And so to me, mentorship has become huge, right? In my personal life, my professional life, because without that example, for me, I wouldn't be in this role that I'm in now, right? And mentorship also comes from, personal, as far as like my mom, who was on this call today. But it comes from all facets of my life. But it is so important. I don't think we put enough or give enough credit to the power of mentorship.
And I'll just echo that, going back to like entrepreneurship, and particularly, we're really trying to support our underrepresented founders. And one of the tools that we use, we have a series of different roundtables for, first-time CEOs, for our builder fund companies, to really surround these first-time entrepreneurs with additional services. You can call it mentoring. It's whatever you want to call it. It's they need to be in touch with other people who have gone down this road before, who can help get them up to speed quickly, find the resources quickly. The serial entrepreneur that has a huge network doesn't have the same issues as that first-time entrepreneur, no matter oftentimes what race or gender they are.
So this has been great, and it's already 1:00. So I want to leave room for questions because we actually have a few, if that's okay. Just want to make sure no one had any kind of final words, and I think we'll have some time to kind of wrap back around. But I wanted to start with a question from someone in the chat. Not sure if they want to remain anonymous. I'll keep them anonymous. So the question is: we are a small growing company. How and where do we start? We talk about this all the time, but there's no action being put in place. How can I start the action? And I think anyone, I don't think it's for anyone in particular. So feel free to answer.
Okay, I'll chime in. So I think I'll probably spearhead a lot of different ideas. Okay, so give me time to think. I think that one place, like if you're starting at ground zero, I think something that you can do is get your leadership together and do some kind of like offsite type event where you're really looking at what are the behaviors and the expectations and the type of culture you want to have as a company. And then you can do a gap assessment to where you are now. So there's a lot of steps in there, but I think you have to know what you want to have. What are the cultural norms? What's the legacy you want to have? What do you want to be known for? So look at that type of information first. Then you do a gap assessment. That gap assessment can be done with an outside party if you want someone that is unbiased. It can be done as a development opportunity for someone that's really interested in that and they want to go and practice informational interviews and pulling data together. There's a lot of different ways you can get creative on doing your gap assessment, but I think then doing the gap assessment against where you are now, and then you can see what work you have to do and where you should initially start. Always remembering that DE&I isn't just a buzzword, isn't just a poster. It's going to be the behavior. It's going to be your hiring practices. It's going to be the way you talk to each other, the way you have meetings, who gets promoted, all of those things, and having systems in place where you can that are going to remove that bias will be really helpful. But I think you have to start with what you want first.
Agree. And the only thing I will add to that is that there are a lot of universities and colleges that have these DEI programs where these students have to do these assessments as projects. And that's a way to get somebody in supervised by somebody that's qualified always, whether it's a teacher or outside consultant. So that's a way to get it in cost effectively where you're not spending sometimes not any money at all, simply that person gets the credit. The college gets to, maybe name drop to say we work with your company, and each party still gets what they need as far as the outcomes. The employer with the knowing where they start, knowing where they need to go, and maybe some tools and references to use to build that up. And then, of course, the college has done what they need to do, which is educate these individuals and helping them promote to get into the workplace once they graduate from the program.
I would just say start somewhere, right? Everything counts, every step in the right direction. I think just showing that you're pliable, you're willing to listen and take action, I think matters.
I was gonna say you are the change that you want to see. So you got like Maygen said, you have to start somewhere.
All right, so I'll go on to the next question. So this one says, a lot of suggestions seem to be effective strategies to help with fostering more inclusion with entry and maybe some mid-level. Can you talk more about how we get more diversity in senior management and C-suite roles in the biotech industry specifically? Which is, it's not an easy answer, but
no, it is an easy answer. Rather, I
okay.
disagree with that. So what I've done with Lucas Bio, we are 85-95% African American or person of color for our C-suite team on purpose. Why? Because I was intentional about it. Now, people may say, oh, well, there are not a lot of Black and brown people in suite seats in biotech, and that is true. But they are in biotech and they are on site. They are just not in the appropriate role and not being paid adequately what they're worth for what they do. So majority of my people in C-suite are no higher than they're as low as supervisor and manager. Some maybe got to director, but the majority of them are supervisors and managers that just never had an opportunity to even go through the trail to even get to C-suite. Same with me. I would have never got to C-suite in a couple of years. I probably would have been 65, 70 years old before I got to C-suite versus the average white person that can literally get there at around 35, 36 in biotech. I know that for a fact. They go get a degree and come back. No disrespect, but this is what happens. So you're going to have to dig down to lower level, entry level managers or entry level leadership roles and pull those folks up, and don't be apologetic about it. People are going to ask you, oh, they're a supervisor. They don't have the soft skills. They never manage. I had somebody tell me, oh, you've never managed more than 100 people. Well, what manufacturing crew got 100 people to one supervisor or manager? Nobody. I don't care what industry it is. It's multiple layers and there's multiple people to divide those 100 people up, because nobody can have 100 people reporting to them successfully. So these are the things that do. You have to dig deep. You have to go get somebody that's maybe been in their position maybe as little as 10 years, 15, 20 years, and they've been in at least a supervisor manager role. Or some of these people just may have been what we call a team leader in biotech on the shop floor, because they never had an opportunity to be promoted because the supervisor stayed in their role for 15, 20, 30 years. Those are the folks that make sure that they're willing and that they're bought into it, to know that there is going to be somewhat of a learning curve. But if they have everything as far as the expertise on paper, the leadership part can be taught to a certain extent. So that's what you have to think about to use as your defense on why you're pulling somebody from that lower level to come so high so quickly. And then they're also going to talk about, well, that's just too much money. You can't give anybody a $30,000, $60,000 raise. Yes, you can. It's done all the time. As long as that person is qualified to do the job and they bought into what they need to do and they bought into certain expectations that you're going to be watching them XYZ, which is natural, then it shouldn't be a problem. But that's what you're going to have to do to get black and brown folks in the C-suite. You're going to have to dig and look and actively look for them, and then also making sure that you're talking to those directors or executives that may be helping you making those hiring decisions, asking around about, personality, soft skills, and all that, to give you the full picture. And again, these elements to help you defend with whoever you need to report to justify such a huge jump in salary and such a huge jump in role.
And that's where that advocacy piece comes in. That's where people like Tia come in, who started her own because of what she wasn't experiencing in other companies.
And also, do not use time and commitment at a company as a reason to not promote that person. Many of us black and brown people to get in leadership positions, we can't stay no more than 2 to 3 years. If we stay longer, for some reason, people just get used to seeing us in their role as the workhorse. And so when we say we want something different, they say, oh, but you're so valued and you get everything done. And oh my God, what are we going to do if you leave? You as an employee do not have to be loyal to an employer when it comes to the betterment of yourself and your family and your financial well-being. So go get yours. If you need to move around out of state, move around across the street, whatever you need to do, I've already accepted that a long time ago. I accepted that way back when the first recession hit in 2008 and black folks was getting laid off like it wasn't nothing. I knew then, for me to go after what I want, I am going to have to move around. I'm going to have to go take this thing into my own hands to get to the level that I want to be at and that was worth my value. At this point, nobody was going to be able to afford Tia and what I bring to the table as far as my expertise. So then I started my own joint. I figured I pay myself what I'm actually worth.
I just wanted to add to that. I agree wholeheartedly, because I think what we see is a lot of diversity up until a point. And then when you get to some of the more senior leader roles, then we hire outside, which tends to be more likeness to the people making the decision, which is just keeping more or less diversity. It's keeping things more the same. So I think it's going back to that accountability again of instead thinking there's no one qualified at the level or it's too high of a jump to bring that person up, like flipping it to more of like who could be ready now, or if we had to choose someone internally, who would we choose and why? What would they need to get them to this next level? Because I think sometimes that will keep us away from a check the box activity where there's like women's leadership development programs or diversity development programs for leaders or different things. But then you're still having people of a certain group pick people who they think are going to be best. And then they end up getting the roles because they went through the program, and it just becomes a succession of checking the box, as opposed to always asking and holding yourself accountable to what you're saying you want to do. If you want to have more inclusive voices, if you want to have more diversity in leadership, you have to hold yourself accountable to that, but then also make those policies visible, because otherwise you're going to end up getting backlash where then you have people thinking, well, they just got that role because they're Black. They just got that role because they're a woman. So you have to really demonstrate also the qualifications and why this person is a great fit as well, because there's so much talent that could be used if we stop trying to look outside and look inside and bring those people up, as Tia was saying. And I think the other piece is really mentorship. And the thing I wanted to say about mentorship is I have found it really helpful to look for mentors that are different than me. And I always suggest other people do that as well. I think it's natural to kind of go to likeness or to go to, well, this person's in this certain kind of role and they can help me, so I'm going to go to them. But I've always looked for people that were like in different countries, that look different than me, that were good at things I'm not good at. And then when you have those mentorships, they're not always going to work. They don't always have to be formal. You might not always have the chemistry, but that's okay. You just move on. But I think it's important that you establish those expectations for that relationship as well. So if you want to have a mentor that maybe calls you out on your blind spots, I would have that conversation and say, hey, I'm okay if you call me out. I recognize that like, I don't know everything. I have blind spots. We all do. So like, I want you to tell me if I'm doing something that's harming me or harming others. If I'm in my own way, I want you to tell me if I'm doing something offensive, if I'm doing something that's stopping me from advancing my career, so that they have permission. Because otherwise those relationships can sometimes not help you grow as much as they could if you have that formality where you're playing nice all the time and not really saying the hard thing. So I think that can also help you if you don't have the leadership that's looking internally, that's finding the right best qualified people you already have. Then you really also need to look at your network, look at who can be your mentor and who can help you get there.
I think
Maygen, did you have? Sorry,
Um,
go ahead, Dr.
I was going to say, I think Mellisa makes a great point. It is important to have a mentor that may be, different from you, but it is also important to have a mentor that also looks like you because representation matters. But I think it is, so there's nothing wrong with having more than one, one that calls you out on your blind spots, one that, helps with professional development. But I think, again, the power of mentorship is something that we don't often talk about. It is a powerful tool as you, progress throughout your professional career.
I guess I echo what everybody said. This is awesome. As far as like for the C-suite and recruiting, I know for us, sometimes it just takes being patient, right? Networking, sometimes it could take a year, it could take 2 years, but just really like going after those, not I hate to say going after, but really staying in constant communication because they may not be ready to make a move today, but something could definitely change. And so I think it takes sometimes a lot of patience. But I really love the, going within. I really love that approach, like succession planning and really thinking about like, how can I groom, who we already have to take on that spot? Because I think it's easy to say, okay, well, we already know this person, we get familiar, with the people that we work with, and we just assume that somebody may be external, but I would definitely love that internal approach as well.
So I wanted to get this question because I think it speaks to a lot of the work that Elizabeth does. I think I saw you answering that, but if you could maybe bring it out for the group. So the question is, I'd like to hear more about the disparity in funding entrepreneurs from underrepresented groups. Can you explain that more and how can it be addressed? I think that is very, very important to talk about. And I think it's a good way to kind of wrap it up because it speaks to impact and kind of the next generation and kind of what comes after and how do you keep this going and make it look different 10 years from now. So I'd love to hear from you, Elizabeth.
So sure. So the disparities are very well documented every year. Single digit funding percents for women and people of color. We're making tiny improvements, but it's still very, very small. So in terms of what can we be doing to help, the good side of the DEI buzz is that there have been a host of new venture funds that have been formed and funded. There's a ton of money going into this space, and that money is being directed to companies with underrepresented founders. TEDCO, we have some additional funding that we've received to expand our portfolio of underrepresented founders, and we're having to put more effort into outreach. How are we making sure that folks in the community are aware of TEDCO, the programs that we offer, the funds that we have available, and what does it take? What are we looking for? And being really intentional to make sure that we're communicating what we need and at what stage a company needs to be at to be ready. And when we've done some gap analysis, we've realized that particularly for some underrepresented founders, they might need a little bit additional support. They don't have the same friends and family network to give them that initial capital. So how can we support that effort? And additionally, the mentorship and leadership examples to help them get to the point where traditional investors will step in. Hope that helps.
And really quickly, I wanted you to speak a little bit about, because we had this in our conversation, a little bit about the importance of data, right? And going back to the data. I think that's something that I feel as though doesn't get talked about enough, because like some companies that shall not be named, will do the analysis, will do the thing, and then it goes into some drawer, never to be seen again, and no one knows what happened, why it's important, etc. So I'd love to hear about the importance of data and how do you make it work for you.
Yeah, so we came in and, we were told by this legislature we had to set some benchmarks for what percent of our newly funded companies would be from underrepresented communities. we said, that's great. We can do that. We think we're doing a pretty good job. But we realized we really didn't have the data. We weren't asking the questions in the right way. We were getting incomplete responses. And we were in the position of having to guess about what community certain individuals belong to. And so we were revamping as we speak. We're creating a registration process where race and ethnicity is going to be part of the first step of coming into TEDCO, because we're trying to make sure that we have broad representation entering the funnel and equally making it through the funnel. And if we don't have the right people entering the funnel, what do we need to be doing better to get them into the funnel? And if they're not making it through, is there additional programming and support to enhance their probability to make it through the funnel? So, but data is really the first piece. Like, we think we're doing a good job, but I'm a data girl. I want to see the hard numbers, and I want to be able to say with confidence, here's where we were. These are the programs we've put in place, and these are the results. And yeah, so data is really a foundational piece, I think, when starting some of these DEI efforts.
Anybody else want to speak to more so the hard numbers, the importance of that? If not, we have one final question that I think I can ask in a way that'll kind of wrap this conversation up. Okay, so I'll go to the final question. This person says, I'm a part of a DE&I committee for a small growing agency. We just completed our first gap assessment and found a trend with our employees on a desire for recognition and education on invisible diversities. In the biotech landscape, where do you see the benefits and challenges of invisible diversities like neurodivergence and non-visible chronic illness? What are the appropriate, and I think this is really key, is like, what are the appropriate ways to bring awareness to this issue? What kinds of resources can we provide to both our employees and clients to address these issues? I think that's a big thing. So I feel like this speaks, I think, back to kind of Mellisa and someone else mentioned, like, someone who really wants to do the work, but maybe feels awkward about how do you introduce the conversation? You know, where does that start and stop in terms of, you know, should I speak out on issues that may not directly affect me? You know, how do I empower maybe someone who does, quote unquote, fit into that category, but maybe doesn't want to have that conversation? Maybe they don't want to be the token person. You know, how do you make it comfortable? How do you make the space open to really have those conversations about invisible diversities and neurodivergence, non-visible chronic illness, and other things, you know, like socioeconomic differences that really shape, you know, how people view the world. So that's open. It's open for anybody to answer while we have really like 5 to 7 minutes left.
I was going to say that some of these things that they're talking about already have some type of national advocacy group out there that promotes these things. That may be a start. A lot of this stuff to get I guess they figure out how you're going to have the conversations, that you're going to have to do a lot of research outside of work. So you're going to be passionate about this thing, doing your research outside of work hours, and then getting those resources and figuring out a way to put it together. It goes back to what we was talking about earlier, making sure that you have somebody in management, I don't care what level, that's on your side to kind of advocate for you to do this. And I'm a big proponent, again, once you get that together, making sure you're pro HR and let HR navigate all the hard stuff, so that you're not excluded or put out on Front Street when it doesn't work out necessarily in your favor or doesn't work out to plan of how you envision it to happen. But you got to have other individuals that may be in a higher position or that can advocate you, I'll say in a safe manner, to see whether or not that program can be put into action. But majority of the research on some of the stuff as far as neurodivergence and non-visible chronic illness, you're going to have to do on your own and see what's out there. You may have to do some cold calling to see what they're willing to do. Are they willing to come do some type of speaking engagement on site? And then HR and your manager can do the rest as far as trying to figure out if it needs to be funded, how to get it done, what date, what time, all of the hard conversations that they need to have to actually get the event or the situation off the ground.
Any other resources, things like that?
I'll add, I think some of that is, so I've seen neurodiversity ERGs in companies in biotech. So I think that that's always, if there are employees that felt engaged enough to say that that's something that they wanted more recognition or acknowledgement, that could be an avenue. I think it's also looking at any programming that you have around like EAP or mental health and well-being. Like, do you have resources available for your employees to use? That can be really helpful as well. And then I think with a survey like that, based on the question, I would really want to be able to have more like interviews with the employees to understand what they mean by that. Because I heard recognition tied with this. And so I'm not sure if it's acknowledgement or if it's recognition of employees is separate from the neurodiversity. So I think when you have surveys, you have to be very important, like very critical about your questions and test them to make sure you're going to get the types of responses that you're intending to get based on the question. And then when you're asking questions like that, I think it's always helpful to have a comment box or to have people self-identify if it's anonymous, if they're open to a conversation. If you don't have that, you could also just promote that you're going to have a forum, that you could have like if you're doing something virtual, a Zoom call, people could come self-identify and talk about their experience and share kind of what they would be looking for. But I think getting more, you don't want to just kind of throw darts or spaghetti at the wall and just like hope you're solving the problem. You're going to want to really know what they meant by that response. But I would start by looking at what are the resources you have around neurodiversity and mental health and well-being.
Anyone else? All right, so this was like I thought it would be, an amazing conversation with a lot of different perspectives. One of the things that I've noticed in the conversation is that it takes a lot, and it feels like it takes a lot, and also it feels like it doesn't take a lot. And I feel like what I mean by that is like it really takes momentum, right? You kind of have to get a bunch of smaller things in place, get the conversation going, have initiatives going, have visibility going, have people, doing reviews of the work that you're doing. You kind of have to hit all these marks. So I think it's important to realize that it may not happen overnight, and that you have to build up that momentum is what I'm hearing in order to get that change in the numbers. And then you see, oh, wow, we've hired, 50% people from this. We've, invested X amount of money into these people after the work has been done on the front end. And we have the mechanisms in place to verify that we're actually doing the work that we intended to do at the beginning. So I really don't have much to say, right? Other than I encourage everyone who is still here to connect with the panelists. I know we had at least one question that we weren't able to get to. So I definitely encourage you to connect. Also connect with BioBuzz, because there's going to be other content and potentially other conversations to spin out of this one that will be more sort of like, how do I do this sort of case studies in terms of, here's the scenario I'm in, how do I navigate this? And, like we talked about in this, it's important to find a mentor, to find someone that you can talk to and bounce off ideas and get feedback from, and, all of that. So once again, I want to thank all the panelists for coming and logging on from wherever you're at, coffee shop, Atlanta, etc. And I really don't have much to say. I don't know if anyone has any final words, but I really had a great time. And I'm looking forward to the next time we have this conversation. And I hope people got some lunch, or everyone can go get some lunch, because I know it's lunch hour. I know I definitely will be after this. Thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thanks.
All right, I'll be talking to everyone.
Thanks for hosting.
Of course. All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your week. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Stay safe,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye.